making like little, what are the ones with holes in? Crumpets. Crumpets. You make crumpets?
Ooh, yeah, romantic music for the baking show. It's baking, we're gonna be baking with Ben. This time it's FAQs.
Hi, it's Ben the Baker, and this time I'm sitting down. We're going to do some FAQs, frequently asked questions about sourdough, although no one's frequently asked me many of these questions. More some sort of common mistakes I think people do when they're starting out making sourdough. I'll try and cover a broad spectrum of stuff. We're going to cover things like, why is my sourdough coming out flat in the oven? Why can't I get a good definition on the score of the loaf? Why, when I'm shaping the dough, does it pancake it out? Also, why is my dough not rising enough in the bulk fermentation stage? So we're going to cover quite a few different things. If there is some stuff that you're not that you wanted to find out about but you didn't get through this video, drop me a message and I'll try and reply to it at the end. So for ease of use, what I've done is I've time-stamped each section in the video, and the time-stamping will be in the comments in the bit section underneath. So if you want to fast track to somewhere, you can do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start from the very start, the starter. First, so tip number one, if your starter is not in a prime condition to be mixed into your final bread dough, then you're setting off on the wrong footing. You need to make sure that your sourdough starter is at its peak condition. So what is a peak condition? Well, what you want it to be like is you want it to smell a little bit like ripe yogurt. You want it to be showing some bubbles. You also want it to be able to float in some water. The float test is something that I've shown people before. You can find it on some of my videos in the past. But performing the float test is a really good way of finding out if your dough is ripe. I think one of the things that people sort of get wrong is they assume that if it's bubbly, it's fine. It will make bread if it's bubbly, but what I would say is try and feed it twice a day. So put it on a 12-hour cycle, and then the day before you're going to bake, add in a couple more feeds in between. Heat up the water a little bit more, and then leave a little bit more leaven in your starter. So usually what you do is you get rid of about 90% if you're just trying to keep the dough ticking over. But if you're prepping it to get ready to be baked, I think the best thing to do is to maybe get rid of about 65-70% of the dough, and then just before you're about to bake, so 4 hours before you're about to bake, give your starter another feed, and you want to feed it relatively warm with about sort of 30% of the leaven left behind inside. And then you want to just keep checking it just to make sure, just to see if it'll pass the float test, because it's actually better to use a starter that is a bit younger, so when it's just about getting active. So that's my first tip. Pretty obvious one really, but the more accurate you are with like weighing out your ingredients and your water temperature, the less likely it's going to be that's gone wrong. So you can scratch that from the problem list. Accuracy also means being accurate with your timer as well, okay? 30 minutes. Water temperature is one of those things that people overlook loads. You really want to make sure that the water going into your dough is really quite warm, because you don't want your dough to lose temperature. As soon as it loses temperature, the sourdough starter is just not going to latch onto that, and it'll exponentially lower in activity. So trying to get a dough back up to temperature, or in a good temperature range for sourdough to ferment, is really difficult. There's a couple of ways in which you can do that. You can put it in a largest pot you've got, create a bain-marie and just let the dough float inside, or you can stick it in the oven with the pilot light on. But that's one of the key things. Try and keep your dough at a warm temperature, roughly between 75 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which I think is something in Celsius. I'll write it up here somewhere in this bit if the font and the colour work properly. So just while I'm mixing this dough, few words on sourdough. Basically, you only get better at sourdough, I think, if you marry that academia about sourdough with also practice. And it really is one of those, it's the worst thing to hear, isn't it, on like a tutorial video, someone saying, yeah, you won't get good at it unless you practice. But yeah, that is exactly the case here. I was rubbish at making bread for about 5 years. It takes a long time to get okay at it. So just yeah, keep going and don't ever feel defeated. Okay, right then. So in the absence of a lab coat, I've got a pointer, and I'm gonna drop my glasses down to look more teacherly. Only one of you asked for it, but you're all going to get it. I'm going to do a science lesson about sourdough. You can move further ahead in the video if you want to avoid this bit. I would not be offended. It's perfectly fine. Okay, so what is going on? What the hell's going on in sourdough? Very good question. You're paying attention at the front. The answer is loads of stuff's going on. Okay. Our job as a sourdough baker is to harness the power of microbial bacteria and funguses working together to eat the starches inside of the flour. Okay, we're piggybacking on a biological process that's been happening for thousands of years, whereby little micro things start to break down. I don't know. Where they start to break down biological matter, okay? Simply like compost or stuff rotting, okay? Little itty bitty things eating things and breaking them down. Who are the main players in that world of microorganisms when it comes to sourdough baking? You may ask. You haven't, but we'll pretend you have. Here we have Saccharomyces cerevisiae. This is a fungus / mould, which we call yeast. This isn't the only fungus and mould that you can find in sourdough. It is tiny, but it's one of the main ones that you'll find. Okay, it sort of looks like a bunch of grapes. You can see here, little bunch of grapes, but they have little eyes on. They ain't eyes; they're belly buttons. And what they do is they grow by like sprouting out of those little belly buttons and then slicing them off, and then they multiply like that. Thing that you need to know about this Saccharomyces cerevisiae is that it's a fungus and a mould, and it works with types of bacteria. They have a cooperative relationship that helps break down the sugary starches inside the flour, and as a byproduct of that, you can see the little farty marks here. Little gas cloud, it creates ethanol. Okay, this is important later on because this is going to help with some of the structure of our sourdough. Okay, moving over to this side, we have Lactobacillus brevis. This is a lactic bacteria, as you might have guessed with that fancy name. Yes, that is also lactic. So lactic meaning like lactose, milk, dairy product, blah blah blah, that sort of stuff. It is a bacteria, so some bacteria are good, not all bacteria are bad. Our body is full of bacteria. Mine in particular has a lot more bacteria than most people's, but then I am a mucky pup. Lactobacteria, as a byproduct, creates lactic acid, which gives our bread lots of nice sour flavour, which is great. And also it creates, as a byproduct, carbon dioxide, and that's the key thing that helps our sourdough rise in the oven and have a nice, beautiful, big, open crumb structure with all the nice holes in. So these two work together they eat starch and then they fart out lactic acid, carbon dioxide, and ethanol. Okay, that wraps up our science for today. Except we're going to do a bit more science later. Sorry. Make sure that before you divide your dough that it's showing loads and loads of activity. So that means it's starting to look a bit domed on the top and that you can see some visible bubbles. So if your dough, when you're dividing it, is starting to pancake out a little bit and starting to look really flat and deflated, that might mean that you've not built up enough strength during the folding. So we want to shape these loaves so that they sit up really, really nice and proud and to attention, okay? Something like this one. What you can do is if this does happen and you do find that the dough starts to pancake out, usually what I do is I pre-shape these and then I leave them for about 30 to 40 minutes. What you can do is at like 15 or 20 minutes is just reshape them back into a ball like this, just to get them to sit up and offer a little bit more structure. So I'll show you how I shape with my scraper, and this is how I build in a little bit more tension to my dough than the technique that I showed you in the previous videos. Get a little bit of water on your hand and on the blade. So I'll take my scraper and I'll work the dough knife from behind and bring it towards me. And then you just want to work the dough round from in front of you here, pushing the dough away, bring it round and then bring it towards you. And as you bring the dough towards you, you want to bring the angle of the blade up. So it's a tight angle, a high angle there. Just work that dough round like that and just keep repeating that. And we're tucking the dough underneath itself as we work around, okay? And this hand here, all that's doing is just, it's basically helping the dough knife come away, okay? So just let it roll around like that. You can pick it up and move it if you need to. Keep working the dough, pulling it towards you. So moving it round and then pulling it back. Moving it round, pulling it back and tucking that bit underneath. Okay? Okay, hi. Welcome back to the lab. A bit of a sciencey section for you. We're going to talk about gluten. Gluten is, it's not a big bad wolf. Obviously it's not so great for some people, but it's actually really useful for bread bakers because what it does is it creates a structure, an internal network that helps capture all of the carbon dioxide that's released from the fermentation inside the dough. And also what it does is it creates and holds the moisture that creates the suppleness of the crumb and like the mouth chewy, lovely sort of feeling inside your mouth when you eat bread as well. So the crumb does loads of different things. It captures lovely, great big bits of carbon dioxide, which makes the loaf rise nice and high in the oven. It's great, okay? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how gluten's formed and what it is and what happens there. Okay, so gluten is formed up of two proteins. One is called gliadin, which is this one here, and that's made up of a chain of little balls, basically. And gliadin, basically, that's what makes the dough really sticky and adhesive and extensible. So kind of like how much you can stretch it out, basically. That's what gliadin is responsible for. And then you also have glutenin. Glutenin is this sort of stringy stuff here, and that helps our dough with its strength and elasticity. Okay, so that means that it helps. So when we stretch it out, how good it can, what's its ability at going back to the same shape it was before. So that's its elasticity. Okay, so that's gliadin and glutenin, and they reside inside of starch molecules. So this is a starch molecule here. So once we add the water and we begin to agitate that mixture, the water is absorbed by the starch molecule here, where the gluten and the gliadin reside, that molecule starts to swell. And then as that happens, gliadin and gluten start to make friends. And when they begin to make friends, with a little bit of agitation, we begin to get gluten. And that's what happens. These little ball bits and these little string bits, they kind of align and intermingle, and they create the sort of dual power of sticky adhesive extensibility and strong elasticity. Okay, and that's what we're looking for in our bread, so that we can capture those lovely bits of carbon dioxide that are bubbling up through the fermentation. Okay, there we go. That is gluten in a nutshell. So your dough is sticking to your basket or in your bowl with your tea towel. There are a few things that we can do to help stop that from happening. So one thing is your choice of tea towel. Make sure that you're not using like a textured tea towel like this. It can work okay, but what happens is that the dough sort of like gets caught inside the textures. If you've had a problem with the dough deflating, sometimes it can be that you've done a perfect job all the way through making the bread, and then you get to this final point, and just because you are a little bit hesitant or a little bit gung-ho maybe, you rip the dough and then you deflate the whole thing. Try and get yourself a thicker mesh tea towel. Make sure it's totally drenched in flour. I use wholemeal flour. The bran inside the wholemeal flour tends to help the dough come away from the tea towel. I also use a J cloth instead of a tea towel because it's quite sort of resistant to the dough somehow. You can also use semolina or polenta or rice flour mixed into your wholemeal. That really helps because it's really anti-absorbent, so it'll just come out of the basket really nicely. Another good tip to help you help the dough from stopping to stick from the basket is to just hold it like this and let it just drop down, and let it just sort of come away from the basket edge either side before you let it fold into the dough. My dough's really wet. Should I add flour to it? The only time that you want your dough to really come into contact with flour is just before you start shaping, the pre-shape, then the final shape, a little bit of flour, not very much, and then finally when it goes into its baskets, give it a real good roll in flour. At the start, when you've just mixed all of the flour, water and the pre-ferment together, you are going to have a really sticky and wet mass of dough. The dough will absorb that additional moisture as you perform the folds. Try your best to avoid the temptation to add any flour before you get to the shaping point. If you add more flour, that's just going to weight the loaf down and it's never going to achieve that fantastic rise that we get. And actually, if you add more flour at that early stage during the folds, that's actually going to make it stickier and wetter, because what you're doing is you're adding raw flour to wet ingredients, and it's going to start to make those starch molecules inside the dry flour swell, and it's just going to be really sticky. As the gluten develops inside of a wet dough, it becomes more absorbent. You have to just trust that the method and the ingredients that you've got in there are correct. Okay, just keep following the process and everything should be fine. So the window pane test is when you get to the end of your 3 folds and you pinch a little bit of the dough out and you stretch it between your fingers really delicately. You should be able to see this sort of like permeable membrane. You should be able to see your fingers through it when you look through it. If it doesn't pass that test, there's a couple of things that might have happened. One is that you've not developed the gluten enough, which means that you need to perform another fold and leave it for another half an hour. Repeat the window pane test, and then if it's still not passing the window pane test, just repeat that again, leave it another half an hour, and see where you're at after that. It should be after that. The only other thing it could be is that you're not using strong enough white flour, because the gluten strength comes from how much protein is in the flour. Okay, try and find yourself a really strong white flour. If you can find some Shipton Mill do a really good organic white flour. Their ciabatta flour is good, their number 4 white flour is great, or their strong Canadian is really good as well. But try and find yourself the strongest white flour you can, and if the stronger it is, the higher amount of protein, the stretchier it'll be, and the more likely you are to get that windowpane test. Okay, so another common problem that people come across is they get to the end of the bake and they brought out this loaf. They cut into it and they have a little taste, and either it's like super sour or not sour enough. What are the reasons for that? And how can we manage the dough so that it gets into a place that we want it to be? Well, as sourdough bakers, we can manipulate the sourness of the dough. The sourness comes from the lactic bacteria that comes, so basically what did I call? What we want to do is kind of create and encourage an environment that best suits that. If your dough is really well proved, it should also be quite lactic. So one of the things that I like to do is I like to make sure that my sourdough starter, when I add it to the bread, is still quite young. So depending on when you use that starter, if it's earlier on in its life cycle, your sourdough will be less sour when it comes out at the end. If you decide to add your starter later on in its life cycle, sort of 8 hours in, it's going to taste a lot more sour because you've got a lot more spent sour flavour in there. Okay. What you can also do is you can leave your sourdough to rest a lot longer. So if you put your sourdough in the fridge and you like your sourdough sour, you can leave it in the fridge for up to 48 hours. That will slow its activity right down. But the Lactobacillus brevis, that will carry on working slowly because it can operate at a much lower temperature. So it's going to carry on just knocking out a little bit of lactic acid. Also, rye flour, that often adds a little bit more sourness to your dough, or a wholemeal flour as well. How do you get your sourdough nice and shiny and like nice and crispy and shiny on the outside? That's a very good looking question. As ever with sourdough baking, there's a couple of reasons for that, and there's a couple of things you can do to help make that happen. Obviously, a few options that I've mentioned before. You can put a baking tray at the base of your oven, and just before you're about to bake, throw in a few ice cubes if you don't have a cast iron pot or some Pyrex or a ceramic pot or whatever. But if you do have that, that's ideal. So I like to bake in a Pyrex dish or in a cast iron dish, and that locks in the moisture from the dough. So any moisture as it bakes comes out of the dough and then sort of bastes it in its own juices. Just use a brush to lightly brush away any excess flour that you find on the dough. That makes a massive difference, just getting rid of that. And then, another handy hint, just give it a little spritz of water. So, you're struggling for volume in your sourdough, which means that you're not getting enough height in the final oven spring. So how do we combat that? How do we make sure that our sourdough gets plenty of height in the oven? So this is sort of an accumulation of doing all the things right. The sourdough starter that you're putting into the dough is a little bit younger, so it has a lot of time to grow, and that it's very strong and very active. Don't put in a sourdough starter that you've not fed well or looked after well. It needs to be really well looked after. It needs to be showing plenty of activity on its 12-hour cycle. That is paramount. And then during the folds, we need to make sure that we're being really, really considerate with the folds, and that we're diligent with it, and that we are building gluten strength. So what I would recommend is, with the 3 folds that I suggest in my sourdough video, try and aim to be vigorous with the first one, less vigorous with the second one, and then gentle with the third one. Because then, as we go through that bulk fermentation and folding stage, we want to maintain some of the air bubbles inside of the dough so that those can be transferred to the final dough when it comes out and gets baked. I'll show you what I mean by just performing the last fold on this one here. So a little bit of water is really useful, just a bit on your hands. And then I'm going to go down the side like this. I'm going to try and pick up a large mass of the dough and just gently stretch it and fold it over like that. But the idea is to try not to agitate the dough too much. We'll keep working the dough around. And that's pretty much it for our final fold. But you should be able to still feel that it's got some volume in there. You should be able to feel bubbles under the surface. If we carry on handling it really, really heavily, like we were at the start of the process, as we are at the end, then we'll be knocking all of that gas that we've worked really hard to build up all the way through the process. So gluten structure and gluten strength is paramount. And then it sort of comes down to shaping. So make sure that you're shaping your pre-shape as tight as you can. And then also when you're final shaping, try and put a bit of stitching in there, so which is just sort of stitching the dough up. So you just want to pinch the sort of sides of the dough along the seam, and then just pinch them out, stretch them over like that, and then pin them down. And that's just going to give it a little bit more tension either side, just as you go. And hopefully that'll help your dough have a bit more of a pop in the oven, like that. My final bit of advice is make sure that you've got your baking surface or your baking pot as hot as it can be, and that it's in a sealed unit or there's plenty of moisture. Because if there's not enough moisture, what's going to happen is the dough is going to form a crust on the top before it can expand outwards. That's sometimes when you might have seen like a sort of UFO shaped bit of bread. Make sure that the dough is properly proved before you bake. Finally, really important, often overlooked, make sure that you're scoring the loaf properly, okay? If the dough is really overproved, you want to score it really lightly. If it's very underproved, you can score it quite deeply. And when I say quite deeply, up to 5 mil. And then also try and angle your blade sort of under the loaf. And then also try and angle your blade sort of under the loaf and go down like that. That creates a really nice ear. The ear offers loads more volume to your loaf, okay? So try those things and hopefully they'll work. If not, hey, shoot me. Hey, how come your sourdough's got nice bubbles in it? Mine ain't got no bubbles, it's all flat and stuff. I want like nice big bubbles, aeration, open crumb structure. This is the last one, don't worry. Last health tip. Last tip. The tip of the iceberg. Best thing to do to get yourself a nice open crumb structure, sort of going back to what I said before, make sure that you've proved the dough properly. Also, the more hydrated your loaf is, so the more water you add, the more likely that the dough is going to create like an open crumb structure, so an open network. But also, again, you've got to use like a really active starter and a really, really strong white flour. Okay, that's going to be super helpful for you. And again, it's just about being delicate with your folds. The more delicate you are with the folds and the more delicate you are with the shaping, the more you can maintain that open crumb structure inside your dough. That's pretty much it, really. If you want to experiment with a higher hydration, take a look at my sourdough formula. Currently, my sourdough formula is at 70% hydration, which is all of the percentages in bread are measured against the full weight of the flour. So in my case, I use 1 kilo of flour, and therefore I use 700 grams of water, and that equates to 70% of water. So if you want, you can take that hydration percentage up to about 80%, in which case it would be 800 grams of water. That would significantly change the composition of the loaf. It would also make it a lot harder to handle for you if you're starting out, so just be a bit cautious. But if you're really after those open crumb structures, that's kind of what you want to do. Go crazy. Have a good time, but be safe. So that's the end of the sourdough FAQ. Frequently asked questions. With the next video is going to be about how to use sourdough starter discard, and there's a few really cool things you can do, like making crackers and putting them in like muffins and loads of other stuff. I'll show you, and it will be a little bit of a shorter video, and that should come out at some point later. Cool. Thanks for watching. Bye.